everyone. Welcome to Word Made Digital. I'm your host, Joanna LaFleur, and this is the last episode of Season 1. I am so happy to have my friend Rich Birch on this podcast. You may know him or you know of him through Unseminary. It's a podcast, it's a website, it's resources, it's books, it's all things about all the things they didn't teach you in seminary. That's why he calls it Unseminary. So he is a guy who was actually leading in one of the very first multi-site churches in North America. So he's going to talk multi-site churches, talk about how that tech has developed over time, how they kind of trial and error through mistakes, learned how to do multi-site as one of the first churches doing it. And also we're going to look at just what effects have the digital screen age within churches had on people, for better and for worse. How are we reaching people and communicating to people in different ways now that we have a lot of screens in a lot of our churches? We're going to be looking at that. 5 million people every Sunday attend a multi-site church campus. And so it's a lot of people, a lot of you maybe are involved in multi-site churches. So we're going to explore that and look at the human side of communication in video sites. Also, we're going to talk about the change socially right now that's happening, the high speed of change, and why Rich sees this as the seeds of revival when society can change quickly, how he sees that as the hope of the future of the church. So where do we see hope, and what's going on with evangelism and outreach and communication and creativity and the digital world that we live in? We're going to try and tackle all of that stuff in about an hour worth of conversation. I think you're going to love this conversation with Rich Birch. So stay tuned into the episode, and stay tuned all the way to the end to hear what's coming up next for Word Made Digital.
You're listening to the Word Made Digital podcast with Joanna LaFleur, where we discuss all things creative and communications for the church. The church carries the best news in the world, so we want to help you be the best creatives and communicators in the world. Let's go.
Rich, thanks so much for joining me on the podcast today.
I feel like I finally made it because I'm on your podcast. This is like, some people talk about being a New York Times bestseller. I am on this podcast. When I was a little boy, I lied awake and said, one day I'm going to be on Joanna's podcast. So I'm glad to be here. Thank you.
Oh, man. Well, I don't know about any of that, but I'm so glad to have you. I mean, as a fellow Canadian, it's always amazing to talk to other Canadians who are working in the larger world of church and have a bigger sort of perspective on what's going on. So can you just start out, who are you? What do you do? Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Oh, that's a good question. Well, it's so funny. I bump into other Canadians and I always feel like, oh, you're such a better Canadian than me. Like I'm like our mutual friend, Chris Vache. He's literally the only Chris in Canada. He calls him Chris from Canada. He's the only one. And I'm always like, oh man, like I'm not a very good Canadian. I always forget I'm Canadian. But anyways, so my name's Rich. I'm a church leadership wonk. I love talking to church leaders. I love thinking about church leadership. I love thinking about, communications and how that all happens at churches, marketing, that kind of thing. I've been in ministry for basically 20 years. I'm a mid-40s leader, which means I'm not like a young leader, but I'm not an old leader. I'm just a leader.
Yeah, you're sort of in that awkward teenage stage.
Yeah, absolutely.
You're not the cute, young, enthusic thing anymore, and you're not old and wise with all the wrinkles on your face.
That's very true. That is who I am. Absolutely. So, really, the bulk of my ministry experience has been at 3 different churches. 2 of them in the kind of Toronto area. One was called the Meeting House, which I don't know if your listeners have heard of. It's a multi-site church in the GTA, starting kind of the west end of Toronto.
Yeah.
And we started doing multi-site in like 2001, 2002, early years of that whole movement, which is a whole fascinating conversation in and of itself. We started doing multi-site.
Yeah, nobody was doing it.
Yeah, exactly. At the time, I remember there were a dozen other churches I found who were doing this thing, and I couldn't believe that there was a dozen of them. I was like, this is amazing. There's so many churches. Now there's somewhere over 1,000, which is amazing. So, and then I spent a couple of years at a church north of Toronto called Connexus Church, which some of your listeners might be aware of. Carrie Newhoff is the lead guy there, and then most recently was in New Jersey at a church called Liquid Church in the Manhattan-facing suburbs of New Jersey. Lead pastor there was a guy by the name of Tim, or is it a guy by the name of Tim Lucas? Fantastic church. That was in New Jersey. I used to joke, and it's kind of true. We used to say, we're basically trying to reach the Sopranos, and that's kind of true. Kind of, if you picture, what are people who kind of live in the shadow of the global, city of New York. That was really our context. So that's kind of been most of my experience. That's really where I've spent most of my time.
Yeah. And when you did that kind of bigger move down to the U.S., why did they bring, because you're a Canadian, why did they bring you? Like, what was really the role that they were pulling you down to?
Yeah, to help with.
Yeah.
Yeah, so this is a classic Canadian question, because most Canadians would be like, why on earth would Americans want to hire Canadians? Because, we're not very good at what we do. We have this, small man disease in Canada. So I'm just kidding. So it was really Multisite was the original thing. So I, on the side, have been doing for years. I've been doing kind of Multisite coaching with churches. And so they originally had me down when they were in one location thinking about going to two. And I started in this kind of coaching relationship with them. And then they, which was kind of the ultimate compliment. They were like, well, you should come join our team. And I was like, no, see, I've been to New Jersey. I don't want to move here. But obviously one thing led to another, and absolutely love. And it's kind of actually a bit of a twist of fate that I've ended up back in Canada. I literally would have thought, if you would have asked me a year and a half ago, I would say I'm going to retire in New Jersey. I loved it there. It's a great community, which even people who are from New Jersey are born and raised there. They're like, that's crazy. No one loves New Jersey. And I'm like, I loved it. I think it's a great community. It's a really cool, fantastic, interesting location. We lived about 45 minutes from Manhattan, and there were 6 million people from between my front door and Manhattan. It's incredibly densely populated. It's the most densely populated state in America, even though basically half the state is empty. So it's an amazing place. So yeah, I started down there really from a multi-site point of view, sat in the kind of service programming, campus expansion, outreach, and kind of special projects seat on their lead team.
Right. And so, going a bit earlier in the history, bring us back to those early days of Multisite. The days before everybody having the internet in their pocket. You were learning how to do Multisite. And so, on this podcast, looking at it from the communications and tech perspective, I think people would have an interest in what did that physically look like? How did you go about doing that? What did you try? What failed? What worked?
Yeah, well, if you've got a minute, I'll tell you this funny story. So we were in a high school or in a middle school. We were meeting on a just kind of your typical, if you picture, built in 1983 middle school. Our main kind of room we were in the drama room. So it was like this black box theater. That's where we were meeting on Sundays, and the church was growing, and, people were coming. For people that don't know, Brexy Cavey, who's the lead communicator there, fantastic communicator. We had gone from one service to two service, had continued to grow. At that point, Brux was typically preaching over an hour every service. Wow. So it was like an hour and 10 maybe. And so it was really kind of impossible for us to go to three services. And we were reticent to go to three. And we had a volunteer, this guy by the name of Rob, who he did video stuff and kind of technology stuff on the side. He's a volunteer. He was a part of the tech team. He said, I've got an extra video camera. I could bring the video camera in and put it at the back of the room, and then we could just run a line out to the video cart. You remember in school they had those carts where they, with the giant TV on the top of it. So they had one of those. And what he did was we connected that camera to a TV out in the lobby. And the big idea was, well, let's ask our volunteers and kind of core people. We'll say to them, hey, if you could just wait and see if there's any space in our services, kind of hang out here and watch the beginning of the service. If there's space, you could come in, but if not, you could just watch this basically out in the lobby. Well, we ended up we got to the point where people would constantly be standing in front of this TV. And so we moved the TV from out in the lobby. It got moved into a classroom, from the classroom to a teacher's lounge, from a teacher's lounge to the cafeteria. And actually we got to the point where there were more people sitting in the video overflow than there was in the main room. And at that point, a couple interesting, fascinating things happened. One, we there was a group of people from Hamilton. So again, for folks that don't know, it's about 45 minutes from where we were, kind of west of where we were. They would end up late because they would drive in, they would be 45 minutes late, they'd be a few minutes late, and so they would end up in the video overflow. And so they would, they kind of got talking amongst themselves as they went to Swiss Chalet. That's kind of like the Canadian Chick-fil-A. And they would go for lunch after, and they got talking amongst themselves, and they came up with this crazy idea. They said, I wonder if there's a way we could use this video out in Hamilton. And now they went to Bruxy, the lead pastor, and kind of said this, and there wasn't, what I don't want to do is overstate how, there was very little idea of what it was that they were talking about. It was like, could we, and the idea was somewhere, it started really as could we start a small group and then we'll just record it and then maybe show it on a Sunday night or something like that. It wasn't really clear on what it was. Could we use this? Well, Brooks will say he thought it was a terrible idea. He's like, this is a really, really bad idea. There's no way we should be doing this. And so he did what all church leaders do when you get your people who you respect bring an idea to you that you don't like. He said, well, let's talk to the denomination about it, because the denomination, clearly they're going to just kibosh this thing. So he went to a guy by the name of Daryl Winger, who's an incredible leader.
Yeah, I know Daryl. Yeah, great
guy, fantastic guy, and basically explained all this, hey, there's these people, blah blah blah. And so Daryl said, it's interesting in a kind of, Daryl, for folks who don't know, is a little bit like Yoda. Daryl, he said, it's interesting you say that, because 3 months ago, we had a group from our church planning team from the denomination come to your church. And we ended up getting there late. And so we sat in the video overflow, and we went to Swiss Chalet after, the Canadian Chick-fil-A. And we went to Swiss Chalet after. And we said, I wonder if there's a way that we could use this video to plant churches somehow. And we said, let's pray about it for 3 months, and we'll see what happens. And then here you are, Bruxy, saying, these people want to do this thing. And so we'll actually like to try it. Now, that started the process of going multi-site. From a communication and tech point of view, we literally made every mistake.
It's Daryl's fault.
Yeah, it's all Daryl's fault. So it's interesting because it was very much like we backed into it. It wasn't a strategic move. It wasn't a hey, this is and then actually a lot of the churches that were early on in that kind of 2002, 2003, early, all those years, they will tell the same story, that it just wasn't it was a response to what was happening. It kind of just happened. And in a lot of ways, the technology, which is an interesting conversation to talk about, the technology enabled it to happen. It kind of got ahead of us in some ways. And we made every mistake in the book. There were weeks where Brux was green on the screen. It was terrible. Well,
what did you use? Was this a VHS tape? What were you actually using? Oh, it was. I was making a
VHS.
joke. Oh.
No, it literally was.
Okay.
So it was SuperVHS was actually what was called SVHS. And what would happen is we had two services, and remember I told you there's long, and they were at 9 and 11. And so what would happen is there'd be about 15 minutes of worship, and then Brux would get up and teach for about an hour. So he would go till about 10:15, and then literally they would record. He would get up to teach. They'd hit record, and then it would record the whole thing. And then at the end they would hit stop, and they would hand the videotape out the side door of the school.
Yeah.
And then it was about, like I said, it was about a 45-minute drive. So again, this is 10:15. The guy who was driving would leave. He would drive it all the way to Hamilton, and they would start doing worship and kind of just keep waiting for this guy to come barreling in the back door. And
I Could Sing of Your Love Forever. They'll just play that song until the tape comes. Okay.
It was probably more like Heart of Worship at that time, Let's just keep singing that over and over. We all have a heart of worship. And he kind of rigged up in his car one of those at a Blockbuster. They used to have those tape rewind machines. You put it in and it would high speed rewind.
Yeah.
He had kind of hot wired that into his car, and then he would hand the VHS tape to the guy who literally would then just press play. That was the system.
Yeah.
And it was really bad. And we've, obviously come a long way. I was just at a church last weekend doing some coaching, and I was remarking to them about, like, it's amazing how far that side of what we've done has come. Like, it's the video stuff looks amazing now. So yeah, it was crazy. It was, and early on, the kind of punchline to that whole story was we had a bad location. The video was terrible. We rushed the launch. We didn't have enough volunteers at the beginning, all that. And that spring, after it had been going for a few months, we step back, and they do a spring survey there. I think they actually still do it. A spring survey is a part of their process. And we stepped back and realized, oh my goodness, whatever that thing is in Hamilton, we didn't even know what to call it. It was like that thing out there. It's reaching the kind of people we're trying to reach. It's having an impact, and in some ways, it's actually healthier than our original location.
Wow.
And so that really is what started us on the pattern to say, well, maybe we should launch some more. And we at that point made the craziest. We had no business making this declaration. We said we're going to do one campus a year for 5 years, which again we had no. There was nothing.
There's no plan. Yeah.
There was very little plan, and we had no business saying that. Like, it was like, we're not qualified to do this. We didn't even know, what this thing was that we were talking about. And now that they have 19 locations, they've actually done more than one a year over the last, whatever that's been, 15, 16 years, which is, pretty amazing, and has had a huge impact on the church.
Yeah. Now, I mean, and we're in the waters right now of social media world. We're seeing that people are taking a step back to say, what have we wrought? Like, what have we done? What have we done to ourselves with the access to our information and addiction and some different issues around anxiety and depression on social media? So I use that as a comparative to say, now we're many years into multi-site churches. You're saying there's over 1,000 of them now. I believe that was your number around North America.
Yeah. So there's 5 million people this weekend will actually attend a campus of a multi-site church, which to me is just ridiculous.
Wow.
It's crazy. Yeah.
And so, I mean, everything's always in hindsight. So we, as far as we can answer that question now, what are we seeing are the effects of this? And maybe not all of them are good. I think a lot of it is good, but what are we seeing now? However, 15 years later, what is Multisite doing to church?
Yeah, that's a good question. So there was a study done by the Leadership Network that asked the question, okay, what is happening in these churches? What's actually going on here? And there's a couple interesting stats that came out. One was that the most effective years of a church. So churches reach the most amount of people that their kind of highest, most effective time in reaching people is in the first 5 years that they exist. And this is a church plant or a multi-site. In fact, it's even more pointed than that. They say that actually the majority of the people that a church will reach is in the first 5 years of its existence. So the interesting piece of that is that basically says that what we're seeing is actually new churches or new campuses reach more new people. That is, and which isn't. I think that's always been a hunch, but they actually quantified that. Now, what does that mean? The interesting thing is what Multisite has allowed is as churches launch more and more new locations, they're able to reinvent themselves and kind of have this growing edge on a consistent basis where they're reaching more people, all the time. They're reaching, new people all the time. And for me, that's the driver. That's been my interest. My personal interest in multi-site has been, 94% of all churches in North America are losing ground against the growth of the communities they're in. So you've heard the more encouraging version of that statistic, which is 80% of all churches are plateaued or in decline. But it's actually worse than that.
Yeah.
The 2/3 of all the churches that are growing in North America aren't growing as quickly as the communities they're in.
Right.
And so multi-site in as a kind of from an kind of movement perspective has been a tool to reach a lot of people. Now, have there been downsides of that? Yeah, I'm sure there are. I'm sure there are things that are, negative aspects of the ministry. And there are, it's interesting because early on, it was like when I would talk to people would call. They were obviously interested. What's going on over there? There was like a reticence of like, oh, that sounds crazy. And like in 2005, it seems like decades ago, I spoke at this conference, and it was, I think, the very first conference on multi-site. And at that point, the meeting house was just over 2,000 people.
Okay.
all of our contemporaries at this conference, they actually the breakout seminar name they gave for us was "Does Multisite Work in Small Churches?" And I said, I was like, hey, I'm happy if that's the title you want. But I think the vast majority of church leaders who are coming to this conference probably will not perceive 2000 as being a small church. But that was kind of the case. The reality of it, it started in very, very large churches, but that's actually not the case anymore. The average church that goes multi-site is actually right around 800 people, and is shrinking all the time. And we're seeing more and more. Even church plants. I have a good friend of mine who's planting in Sarasota, Florida. He started a year ago. He's a few hundred people, 250 people, that attend their church. And multi-site is almost like a kind of presumed part of where their future is. It's like, well, at some point we'll end up doing campuses. It may not be tomorrow, but it seems to be a
normalized.
It's definitely normalized. It's kind of like, would you do, when I started in ministry, there was, believe it or not, debates around, one service or two services. Like, is that a viable model? And obviously that's kind of long gone. That debate's long gone. Of course, you should be doing multiple services. It feels like multi-site's going there. In that context, that means that there are churches who are probably multiplying that probably shouldn't be, because it's not an opportunity. All you're doing is taking what you have and multiplying it, and so if it isn't healthy, what's happening, you're just multiplying non-health, which isn't fantastic.
No, and you think that's because, in simple terms, they're seeing it work in other places, and the technology is so available now. Like, we're not talking about the SuperVHS tape being driven to the school. We're talking about, depending on where people are, but everyone's doing it in a bit of a different way. We're talking about fiber networks and digital stuff, and maybe it's next week recordings and all kinds of stuff. Right. It's almost free. The cost of doing it.
Well, I think there's two things. There's definitely a cost issue. Actually, there's a fascinating chart out there where if you look at your audience is a smart audience. There's a measurement unit for measuring the brightness of a projector called ANSI lumens. Now, the majority of multi-site churches are doing some combination of video and live teaching. That's kind of the middle of the bell curve. But video is that kind of middle of the bell curve. They do both. And there's an interesting chart that shows as the cost of 1,000 ANSI lumens, so the cost of a kind of a brightness unit, as it goes down, actually the launch of multi-sites go up. So there is a correlation between, and that is kind of, I hinted to that earlier. It kind of happened to us because of the technology. Like, it was not a strategic decision. We kind of started using this technology, and then before you knew it, we ended up having a campus and launching a ministry and reaching a whole bunch of people. And I think that's true. I think the other thing that has shifted is it's not just the cost, so the cost is a big part of it, but there's also just people's comfortableness with technology, right? Like, they're both the people we're trying to reach and the people that are leading. There are, and this is a few years old now. This isn't, in fact, it's a number of years old now. There was the Ice Bucket Challenge, a couple of years ago, right? Where from my perspective, that was like this interesting tipping point where it went from like very few people knew how to produce video to everyone was producing video. Like, everyone was figuring out how to use their phone to make video. And I think that has had a profound effect on leaders, where there used to be a like, oh, I don't know, like, and it used to be a lot tougher. And it was like, you had to have, like, when we started, we had like people who were like from television backgrounds and stuff like that, where most churches don't today. They're just like, well, I looked at a bunch of stuff on YouTube and figured out how to do it. And so it absolutely has been democratized. I think not only from a cost, but also just from our orientation around technology has changed, where, it is more accepted to just, use these tools. Yeah. Now, on the human side of it, outside of the technology, we're seeing the face of usually the key. Every multi-site does it a little bit different, but the big idea is one leader or maybe a small group of leaders their faces are being broadcast to multiple sites. Maybe I should be asking a psychologist about this, but I'm wondering about like how that affects the health of the leader, the pressure on them, the stress to perform.
how they're interacting as a pastor and leader and teacher with an audience or a congregation. I'm calling it an audience, and it really is their own congregation, but it feels like an audience because they're however many miles away and they may not really know them in person. How are you seeing the human side of that as for a communicator? How does that play out?
That's a great question. So when you look at where I've spent, the last number of years, basically I've been in that seat working closely with communicators like, Bruxy, Carrie, and Tim, the kind of three lead communicator people that I've worked with. Essentially, my job has been to say to them, hey, what we want to do is set up multiple campuses and get your face on a bunch of screens and leverage because all the models I have been in have although have been a mixture of teaching and live, have really leaned pretty heavily towards video teaching. And so it has been fascinating to watch the kind of internal dynamics of that with those leaders. Yeah. And there's a couple things on that. I think that's a very insightful question. And a lot of people don't ask that question. But what I've said to leaders is I think, and this probably fits more in the kind of spiritual dynamic side. So it's definitely more art than science. But I think God seems to bless or use multi-site church leaders, communicators who are reticent to have themselves on screen. So like when I look at a guy like Bruxy, again, we joke about it earlier, like he thought it was a terrible idea. I think if you were to talk to him, if he was to come on this today, there would be an aspect of it that he would be uncomfortable with, right? Where it's like, I'm just not sure. And now what I found is that most communicators get to the point where they say, I'm not sure about it, but it does allow us to reach people. It does allow us to connect with people. And generally people who have that teaching gift, they are thinking about that. They're thinking about how am I a good steward of the gift that God's given me? Now I don't know, I don't think this is how it works, but I eventually when I get to heaven, there's on the list of things that I want to ask Jesus. One of the questions I want him to answer me is, why is it that the teaching gift appeared to be not evenly dispersed? Why is it that it seems like not a lot of people have that gift? Now, is that actually what has happened, or is it a function of the development issue? Like we're not developing people with that gift, and that to me is an intriguing and an interesting issue. Where I've kind of come down on it, it has been a bit more pragmatic, and I've said, listen, all of the people I've had an interaction with who are, communicators, my kind of heart conviction is if I could line up 100 people to hear that person talk about Jesus, I would, because I think they are the real deal. They're at their core, they're the kind of person that has been transformed by the message of Christ and continue to be transformed by the message of Christ. And that is, I think we want to see that, get out in front of more people. So I think it does. It's definitely a head game. It has changed. If I was to come and visit, I do, these kind of things where I go visit churches and pretty consistently when they're a multi-site church. And if they're doing video, like I'm pretty consistently pushing them on, you have to think differently about the way you communicate. You've got to be more visual. You can't just stand behind a lectern or behind a, stand. You've got to be thinking about symbols and props and graphics and all that stuff because the medium itself is very visual, and you've got to kind of reach through the screen, and people are used to, it's the show not tell thing. We've got to find ways to show our preaching, not just tell our preaching, which is, that's again a whole other conversation. No, that's great, and I think that's sort of where I started with down this road of questions is about, in some senses, I think the fair answer is we don't fully know what the effects of this will be. Like when the people who are 12 years old are 40 years old, what will their engagement with church look like? And the technology and all of the things. What will church look like, and how will what the decisions we've made as leaders have affected their discipleship and their love of church? Absolutely. There are a number of interesting to me kind of movements that are happening that are to me are like these kind of trans church discipleship movements that are folks who are gathering kind of groups of people around them that are almost kind of completely disconnected from a local church. That to me, I think is even more an interesting, so people like, the kind of if gathering crowd of leaders there who are, they essentially are this interesting collection of, kind of social media, blogs, podcasts, kind of gathered together virtually. They might get their communities, and I would say their churches, together 2 or 3 times a year in conferences or, that kind of thing. To me, that's a fascinating kind of whole area of development that, that is kind of like an outcome. It feels very resident to, what's happening online.
Yeah. Well, and it's even, I was listening to a podcast with Carrie and Tim Elmore, I believe is his name.
Yeah.
And they were just talking about how for one of the first times ever, the older generation can't say to the younger, I totally know and get what you're going through, because this is a generation that's raised with a screen in their hand from the moment that they're born. And we don't fully know what that is like yet.
Right.
We won't know for probably a few decades how that has affected people because it's so new. And I think then again, as technology changes quickly, I mean, doesn't it keep us humble, I guess, is probably my conclusion on this, is we don't know what we don't know, and God help us as we try our best to be pragmatic and use what's available to us to serve the church. And we're seeing some huge wins. I mean, in my own church, which is a multi-site church, it's so exciting to see what's happening in these multi-site contexts. And we just had our first baptism, a site that we opened about 6 or 8 weeks ago. We just did our first baptisms. We had 5 baptisms there on Sunday. And I mean, that was awesome. It was so exciting to see what God is doing as our church grows in those ways. And
Absolutely.
Yeah. And so, I mean, time will tell, but there are always shadow sides to any leadership sort of strategic decision we make. There are things that are gained, and we hope way more gained than lost, but there are also things that are nuances that could be shadows or dangers in that.
Well, and I think, and that's true. I think, and I'm not, who am I to push back on you on your own podcast? But
no, it's good.
There is a weird part of that where, although it may be, there is going to be a change. It's going to, change the way we, we interact with each other. That is definitely a piece of the puzzle. The thing I can tell you is people are going to have the same problems they have today, 20 years from now, which is they're not sure how to raise their kids. They're not sure how to interact with, the opposite gender. They're not sure how to, what it means to have a life transformed by Jesus. They're not sure what to do with their internal thought life. All of those things are going to be exactly the same, and this kind of idea that I guess maybe I'm a little bit skeptical on this is so different than what we've experienced before. Like there was a book, there's this guy, Don Tapiscott, who is a Canadian, who wrote a book in 1999. That is forever ago. That is like ancient history, called Growing Up Digital, The Rise of the Net Generation, a fascinating book. Now it is an old book. I remember reading this book in probably it was in 2000. And I remember thinking yes, this is very much this is what we're growing up in. Things are so different. It's, it is. And what he talks about the N generation, and he was really pushing for what we now call the millennials. He thought that group should be called the N generation at that point. And, now looking back at that book, it's almost like this interesting, it feels like folksy and because he had no idea.
Quaint.
He did not predict the future of social media. He knew that the internet was going to impact people, but he never could have imagined what was going to happen. And I think primarily, and this is why I think this may be interesting, and this is a long intro to get to a very short point, but actually these things impact the social side of who we are, I think, much more profoundly than they do the technology change. So the example I always use with people is when I was a kid, I grew up in the late 70s and 80s, and there were still reruns of the Jetsons on TV, and the Jetsons was a 50s and 60s cartoon about the future, and it was like flying cars and like talking robots and all this stuff. It was amazing when you look back at that. It's an interesting kind of study because really what it is it's 1950s America with a flying car.
Yeah.
Like the show did a lousy job of predicting actually the social change that went on. So the example I use is there were no same-sex couples in the Jetsons, right? There wasn't their next door neighbors. There weren't even interracial couples in which is crazy, right? But and so we often look at technology and are like, oh my goodness, like wow, technology is going to change everything. But I actually think technology changes a lot slower than we think it does. It's actually the social change around us that happens a lot faster. And we're living through these constantly. We just take them for granted. This is a non-political statement. Barack Obama came in on his official position on gay marriage, and again, this is non-political. I'm just using it as an example. He came in on a traditional view of marriage. And within his term, that became gay marriage became legal across the entire country. That's an incredibly rapid change in the country. We're experiencing the same thing right now with marijuana. Marijuana use was considered, it was like so unique that Colorado could have legalized recreational marijuana. Well, my prediction is within 5 years across all of them. It's going to be legal within Canada, but within the states, it'll be the entire country. Within 5 years. Again, there was nobody in the Jetsons that was smoking dope.
Pot.
They just weren't.
Right.
Like that didn't happen. Right. There were no same-sex couples. There were not even any interracial couples. There's none of that stuff happened.
Yeah.
Which I think for us in the kind of people change business, for me, I look at that and say that's the seeds of revival. What that says is actually society can change very quickly. We shouldn't be dismayed. I do actually think that if we keep our eye on the ball, keep focusing on seeing people take steps closer to Jesus, we can actually see revival happen in our countries.
I love it. Now you're preaching. I am always on the side of the positive for technology. I wrote my master's thesis all about this issue of sort of the digitization of church, and it was something that I love. It's always stuck out to me from one of my seminary profs. I remember one of the first classes, this was about teaching the faith. This was a course on how to do catechism. I was in an Anglican Church of England seminary, so it was this catechism, how to teach the faith to the next generation. And he reads this quote, that the quote is basically like, the next generation is lazy and they're distracted and they never come to class on time and they never come prepared and they don't seem to be interested in the faith. They're distracted by all these things that are your new technologies in the world. And I'm paraphrasing, but this is the gist of the quote. And then he says, when was this quote? Where is this quote from?
1800 or something.
Oh, no. It was from Augustine.
Right.
This is hundreds and hundreds of years old. And of course, the point being that always stuck out to me, I don't remember all the things in this course, but what stuck out to me about that, whatever we were doing about techniques of teaching people the faith, the discipleship practices of the church, that there are some elements of that are never going to change. There is always challenges because we're dealing with human beings, and there's something about human nature that is consistent. But I agree with you. I think from a technology perspective, I'm pushing back on it because I think I hear so much in my conversations when I sit down and have a coffee or have a beer with people in my own social circles who are working and serving in churches that are reluctant to go in these directions. I am more pro than con, but you hear all the time these concerns about it, and I think it's true. We don't fully know what something will do, but I see so much hope. If the Apostle Paul, had access to Instagram and had access to FaceTime videos and all this stuff, imagine what he might have been excited about using it for and how to reach people in his time.
Right, and so I think we have good examples of that. I don't even think we have to kind of imagine that. So the original text was written in the commercial language, not in the language of the region that it came from. Why did they do that? There was a bias towards we need to get the message out. There was a bias towards we want to impact a broader folks. The Roman roads, Paul clearly was wandering all over the place using the existing network that was there. Why did he do that? Well, he did that because it had been built by, really for nefarious negative reasons. That most of those roads were used to oppress people, and he was saying, well, I'm going to use that for something positive. I'm going to try to use this to see people, connect with Christ. And so I think, again, I'm on the far end of like, I think we have to embrace all this stuff. I think I appreciate you reading that quote or using that quote, because I think we've always, it's a time memoriam. Like, old people look at young people and are like, those people are lazy. And then young people look up and say, those people don't know what they're talking about. That is exactly what has always happened. And I think there is a difference in that the current technology, and you saw this, I'm not sure when this will air, but there was a recent example where Mark Zuckerberg was in front of the Senate and the Congress in the States. And so I happened to be working at home just doing some admin stuff. So I had it running in the background just kind of as back. And then I kept being drawn back to it, because you have these senators who, these people are going to make laws that are going to impact, arguably the most powerful, well, it is the most powerful social network in the world. They're going to do something to these people. And I don't think they understand it.
Not at all. I mean, there's so
like,
many memes about that now. I mean, because that's just a very recent thing that's happened. It's very clear that the men and women who were asking questions of Mark Zuckerberg had almost no clue how the internet works.
Right. And like at a basic level, right? And so there is something to that, and it's not like they were even asking particularly technical questions. It was, kind of fairly low level stuff. And I think Mark, again, to his credit, not that he's listening, but I think, to his credit, I think did a good job trying to be respectful and you could see him thinking, oh, how do I say this and not say, you don't know what you're talking about? Yeah. And I think we have to, it's a practical thing to church leaders around you. There are people today, if you are, so even take Facebook as an example, 60%, it's pretty wide distribution, 60% of people in North America are on Facebook daily. Think about that, 60% of people, which is crazy.
I thought it'd be more than that.
Yeah, well, that's on daily use when you think across the entire, the entire country. It's higher than that in women.
It's amazing.
The most I saw a statistic recently. It was, and I'd have to pull it out, but it's like, it was high. It was like 70 some odd % of women are check Facebook before they get out of bed in the morning. Like it's actually, it is, that's powerful when you stop and think about that. What does that mean? Like what? And so, think about a church leader just practically. If there was something in your town, let's just make this really granular. There's something in your town where there's 60% of the people in your town every day are going to it. So there's a restaurant, 60% of the people in your town are going there every day. There's something going on downtown, 60% of people are going there. You would go and check it out. You would be like, hey, I think I should probably find out what's going on there. Yeah. And what I'm hoping is that people would say, not only will I go check it out, but how can we leverage this for the gospel? How do we leverage this to make a difference in our community? And again, I don't think I need to convince people who are listening to this. I understand. I'm not naive to the fact. I think it does shape, it's that whole the medium is the message thing. I think it does shape who we are. But I've got examples even on that where I think it's in some ways actually I think this digital technology is actually helping disciple people better than if we don't fight it. So Vincent
Donovan, an author, wrote Christianity Rediscovered. It's sort of a classic in missiology and missionary texts. This guy was working with the Maasai people in the 60s and 70s. He wrote a book that's deeply affected me. I would recommend it, this Christianity Rediscovered. But anyways, there's a quote in it, and I pulled it up so I could read it. Evangelization is a process of bringing the gospel to people where they are, not where you would like them to be.
That's good.
When the gospel reaches the people where they are, their response to the gospel is a church in a new place. So reaching people where they are, not where you'd like them to be. And I guess that's where, in this whole conversation where I come to the conclusion of like, at its most pragmatic, it's like, where are people? Well, they're spending hours of their day online. And so how do we engage? And we've moved away now. We've started this conversation talking about physical church sites. But, but in the digital world, obviously, we're sort of alluding to the fact that church is more and more online. There's more digital technology allowing us to do all kinds of things on the internets. And so, what does it look like to reach people right where they are? Because even the most devoted church goer is going less. And when they come, we've got them for an hour or two of the week, and the rest of their week, they're spending more time on Facebook than they're spending in church. So how do we connect with them there? Whether we can bemoan that, it's the degradation of all things, or we can say, well, what can we do to creatively engage with people? And so I guess I'd love to move us into that part of of the conversation.
Yep.
Creative problem solving. This is a podcast about creative communications. And so you are, I think maybe you don't label yourself this way. I'm not sure if you would, but I would describe you as a creative person.
Thanks.
I think you do creative problem solving for a living, and that plays out in all kinds of ways. But I'd love to just kind of bounce into that. You go into organizations and you create solutions to problems. What do you like about that? What kind of gets you excited about these creative problem solving things that you do?
Well, I think, first of all, I appreciate that compliment. People have said that in the past to me, and I always get like the hair stands up a little bit on the back of my neck because I'm like, I know some leaders who are like, I'm so creative, and it's like, yeah, it feels weird. That feels like a weird title to put on yourself, and so I appreciate when other people say it. I think for me, the way I think about creative problem solving is a couple things. One, at the end of the day, there is no problem, particularly in the church world, there is no problem that some other church hasn't already faced. And so there's a lot of churches out there. And so a part of this, and this is why I got into podcasting originally. This is why my default switch, actually, even going back, we told this story earlier on, talking about this whole multi-site thing. My initial reaction, without even really thinking about it, was I got to find some other churches. And this is why I went out and tried to find these dozen churches. And, there were these guys. There was this guy, Craig Groeschel, who was like out west somewhere, and like Mark Batterson, and, and this was before they were Craig Groeschel and Mark Batterson. They were just guys who were doing this stuff. And so what has ended up becoming a lifelong friend, this friend of mine by the name of Jim Tomerlin, I literally called the switchboard at Willow Creek and said, hi, I'm from a church in Canada, and I know you guys are doing some sort of thing in, Wheaton, and who do I talk to about that? And then the person on the other end was like, I'm not sure. Let me put you on hold. And then she eventually, said, hey, you should talk to this guy, Jim. And so I literally called up Jim out of the blue, never knew him. And I said, Jim, what I want to do is come and spend a week at Willow, and you don't have to entertain me, but all I need you to do is open up doors for me to sit in meetings. I just literally want to sit in the back of the room and take notes, because what I knew is if I could get around other leaders who were doing things, not that we would do what they're doing, but what they were doing would collide with what we're doing, and at the intersection of those two things, a new third idea would come, which would then help us to find. And so my instinct on creativity is around, particularly when it comes to problem solving, is let's just do some research and talk to some other people. And it's not about saying we're going to kind of take what they're doing, but it's saying let's see what other people are learning and then apply that to our area. And it's really the kind of collision of those two things coming together. I think personally, I think a lot of church leaders spend too much time staring at the wall with our problems, being like, I'm not sure what to do with this, as opposed to saying, let's go talk to 10 people. And yeah, probably my experience has been you talk to 10 people, 9 people won't, ideas will be like, man, that's interesting. Now they store back in your brain somewhere, and eventually, it'll bubble up and point you in a new direction. I was recently at a church in Greensboro, North Carolina, fantastic church called Mercy Hill, doing great stuff. And they basically asked the same question. They were like, how do you come up with so many ideas? And I said, well, I don't know. I just talk to people and learn, and I'm naturally inquisitive.
Yeah, it's a curiosity. Yeah,
absolutely. And like I said at the beginning, I'm a bit of a church leadership wonk. I'm willing to talk to church leaders all day long about anything and dig into the details and understand. And they were like, well, how do you cultivate that? I'm like, I don't know. You just talk to people and ask lots of questions and wonder about it. And I said to them, and actually the original reason why I got connected with these guys is I had heard that so many churches do an onboarding class, right? They do this, we're going to do a once a month class. I know at our church, we work really hard to try to get people to come to this thing called Next. And, I feel like what we're doing is kind of constantly reducing the expectation. It's like, we'll come during a service. We'll give you a meal. Yeah. We'll make it easy. We'll make it easy. We'll make it easy. Well, these guys, Mercy Hill, they literally go the opposite way. They're like, you want to get connected to our church? We have a thing called the Weekender. You're going to come. They do it every month. You're going to come on Friday night, all day Saturday, all day Sunday.
Wow.
And over that weekend, you're going to learn about our church, everything you need to know about our church. They do the opening night is basically, they have a guy on their staff who's a PhD. He's like, I'm going to walk through the theology of our church. Now, the crazy thing about that is it's working. This is in a kind of led by millennials, super fast growing church, doing an incredible thing. I'm like, to me, that is a fascinating creative idea. Yeah. And I have said to other leaders throughout the years or over the last year, as they've asked about what do we do to get people connected. And I'm like, well, you got to try different things, like even these guys at Mercy Hill. Could that work for you? It's counterintuitive, but it's working in their environment.
Yeah, I love that. There's an appetite for that long form content.
Yeah.
That I'm really intrigued about that.
Well, and the interesting thing they would say, because I've pushed back to them even in this when I was with them last week. I'm like, it seems crazy to me from my perspective. It's literally pushing in. Everybody else is trying to make things convenient, and it's like you've made it super inconvenient. They're like, you got to, I guess spend an entire weekend with you just to get connected to the church. Like that's a huge commitment. And interestingly, the lead guy at the church said, no, it's actually more convenient because rather than coming to 4 classes. Which are over 4 weekends, people just have to give 1 weekend and they can get it all done in 1 weekend. And I'm like, I would have never seen it that way. That's, that's a different way to look at the same issue. So he would say they're trying to do the same thing. How do we make it more convenient? Well, we're going to make people be here for a whole weekend. So I think, how do you be creative? I think a part of it is just be naturally curious, learn from other people. And you would be amazed, particularly in the church world. I think this is true in a lot of markets, but in the church world specifically, you can call up almost any leader and say, hey, I've got something going on. Can I get some time from you? Right. And if you're gracious and generous and let the time be on their schedule and send them a thank you note and you'd be amazed what people would tell you.
Yeah. Well, and particularly now you're in this camp world, which I think is kind of an interesting conversation because I am not hearing a lot of church leaders passionate about church growth talking from a camp context. Now, and I hadn't said this to you before, but my mom grew up at that camp that you're working at. And
nice.
My aunt was on staff there for a period of time, and I think she directed the girls' camp or something. I don't know. There's a history with my family in this camp. I went to the camp down the road, Pioneer Camp.
Yes, great camp.
But I'd love you to talk to us a little bit about the story of you started working at this camp, and there's a lot of creative problems to solve, and particularly what I'm seeing you do in these video communications that you're using and some sort of fun and playful ways that you're getting people to register and getting people to engage with the story of what's going on. I don't know. I just love to sort of open that up a little bit and see what you want to say about that.
Yeah. So I hinted at the beginning of the conversation. I moved back to Canada 18 months ago, and it was a kind of a total change in environment. I ended up back at this Christian camp. It's called Camp Mineo II. It's been around. This is our 72nd year. We've been around forever. It's interesting in a lot of ways. It's like the inverse of what my ministry has been. Most of my ministry has been about saying, how do we take this and do it in a lot of different places, where this camp thing is like it all happens on these 250 acres on the side of this beautiful lake, and it has a physical address, which is kind of unique. And that industry, I didn't realize so this camp has had a deep impact on me, my leadership development. Our mission is to develop tomorrow's leaders through life-changing adventure in God's creation in a very real way. We have a kids camp so we can develop young leaders. So it's actually more about developing leaders than it is about having a great kids camp. And so that's to me is an interesting problem. I think that's an issue in the local church. We've got to figure that piece out. So I came back and am kind of directing that through kind of a series of events. Ended up as the executive director there, and my predecessor was there for 22 years, and so it's interesting following someone who's been there for 22 years. There's interesting stuff around that. But I didn't realize when I came back into this industry that this group of people, generally in this industry, they all think that things are not going well, and that people are. I think because of even some of the stuff we've talked about, the prevalence of technology and all that it's like kind of its best days are behind us. I just don't see that. I think the core idea that parents will go to organizations like ours to say, we actually want to provide an experience for our kids that's disconnected, that does have, there is something about virtual reality. It'll be a long time before virtual reality will compete with your legs hanging off the edge of a dock talking to, an adult leader. Like that's such a compelling experience. I think even more so today than it was, 20 years ago, in a world where parents are nervous to let their kids play outdoors in their own neighborhoods. The idea of providing a place where it's kind of designed for that. It's really built with kids in mind. It's a purpose-built ministry to help kids have a great time in the outdoors. I think is an interesting thing. So yeah, we've been, from a marketing point of view, our growth has been a part of what we've been focused on, which is how do we fill. One of my convictions as a leader is our donors built this thing, and there's a reason why they built it the size they built it. And my conviction is we've got to fill it. Like it's bad stewardship for parts of it to sit empty.
Right.
And so yeah, we've just tried to be. And the social media thing I think is interesting. Like and there's a lot there, but. Like we're trying to reach in our little world, who makes the decision ultimately around kids coming to camp? Our experience has been that's typically mom is making that decision. Typically it's a mom of kids that, dad's involved, but really at the end of the day, mom's going to pull the trigger. How do we know that? Well, we can tell when people send in applications or, send in registrations, the names of people on the credit cards and all that are typically women, not men. And so to me, the play on Facebook particularly or Instagram is a logical play. It's an obvious place to try to connect with our market. And so we
because women are on Facebook and
they are.
What were you saying that you said a few minutes ago?
It's like 2/3 or 75% or something like that of women check Facebook before they get out of bed in the morning.
Yeah. So they might wake up in the morning and there's a video from camp executive director Rich, excited about camp.
Right, and I think that one of my convictions is people, and it relates back to even the multi-site thing. I think people increasingly buy products or engage in organizations to connect with other people, actually not like kind of faceless organizations. Right. And so part of what I've done, and it's not because I think I'm so great, is I've just tried to be more of the face of the organization so that people can, where Mike, my predecessor, wasn't really that way. And it's not because I'm like, people have to follow me. I just think that's actually what the market is looking for. People actually want to know who are the people behind this. And I think even more so when you think that we're going to trust our kids, look after my kids for a week. Well, who is that? Yeah. And so, we've tried to be more in front of people. And the other side of it, which again, maybe an interesting conversation, is the thing I keep saying internally, I'm letting you in on a little secret here, is we are trying to figure out how to make a residential kids camp who ultimately every helicopter parent in North America would love to send their kids to. And one of the things we've learned is people, particularly in the summertime, want to know when their kids are with us, they are super anxious to know what's going on. And so we've gone, which it seems like a logical play to me, but a lot of camps aren't doing it. We've kind of gone off the deep end on posting on Facebook, and we'll do literally like maybe 100 photos a day. We'll do live videos every day. Last summer we pushed over 1 million engagements on our Facebook page in a 2-month period. Wow. And you could see it. What would happen is we would post photos. We didn't announce this, but we got into a rhythm where every day at 9:00 at night we were posting photos of what happened during the day. Well, if our team was like 3 minutes late, people would email, and then what happens is you literally could see the second they go up, because I've obviously got Facebook on my phone and have the Pages app and all that on my phone, and literally I could tell when they had posted it, because the people would post and then our notifications would go through the roof, right? People are like, tagging, and you can tell. One of the nice things about Facebook, at least depending on what happens with all this tracking stuff, you can see that people are digging through all of their photos to find their kids.
They want to see their own kid.
I want to see my kid, what happened with my kid today. And where I think that industry has been built a bit more, not from a nefarious point of view, but just from it's just kind of the structure of it has been like, well, you give us our kids and then you go away. And then we'll see your kids next, you'll see them next week. There's this movie Jesus Camp that came out, 10 years ago, which is a fascinating, incredibly horrific kind of example of bad Christian camping. And it's built around this idea of let's get kids away from their parents. To me, that's an antiquated idea. We're trying to, even this summer, we're doing more to say, how do we expose our parents to what's happening with their kids? Because they want that, and they should have that. They're their kids. They're not our kids. They're their kids. And so we're working harder on the social media front to, think about all that stuff. So.
Oh, I love that. And I mean, you're working with a ton of young leaders, and you're seeing these, it sounds like you're even seeing these campers as these leaders of the future, quote unquote. Now, just on a really practical level, I assume you must have parents sign off on permission. I mean, in my church world, I know it's a very contentious issue. Under 18-year-olds, we want to respect the wishes of the parent, and also a child who may not be able to express their desire or lack of desire to be photographed. I imagine that's just sort of a signing off that people have to do when they bring their kids to your camp.
Yeah, so the advantage we have, that's true, they do sign off. And the advantage we have is people are buying a service from us. And in the terms of services, we're really clear on that we, what we're going to do with social media. And we also increasingly, like we talk about it right in our brochure, we're right up in front. Now, interestingly, we're actually seeing a decline, and parents can opt out, and we do have a process for that, for opting their kids out of social media and getting their photos ending up online. But we're actually seeing, as we do more of that, we're actually seeing that being a less and less factor. People are opting out less, which is interesting to me. I think that's a part of a broader cultural shift around, because I think what people are trading off, it is what they're trading off. They're saying, well, I want to see my kids.
Yeah.
I do actually. And that's how we talk about it with them, is like, hey, you're going to get a chance to kind of ride along with your kids for the week. And we're happy to, if parents want to opt them out, we're happy to do that. Like I say, we have a process built around that. But actually, like last summer, we actually had we had almost 3,000 kids at camp last summer. We had 0 parents opt out.
Wow.
Which was the first time. Normally, we usually have a few. Now, we'll see what happens this year. I don't know what's happened this year so far.
Yeah. Well, and it's true. I love that the strategy is, it's their kid, not yours. We want to see, and more than ever, I grew up as a kid, I lived abroad, and technology to like talk to family back home in Canada was very difficult. And so then in the world we live in the technology that we have, it's very clear to me that people want to engage with their kids.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah,
absolutely. They're intrigued for that, and I see it. We see it as a service to them, not as like it's not a slick marketing play.
Yeah.
Now, it does ultimately for us. Again, and this is just directly imported from the church world. One of my convictions is people don't make a decision to come to church because they saw an ad on online, or they see an ad on definitely on a billboard or something like that. That's a super personal decision, and it's the same in the camp world. People only make the decision to come to camp because a friend tells them you should send your kid here. Yeah. And so we're just trying to make that easier, and social media does do that, right? It's easier for them to kind of talk to their friends and when you've done all this stuff online.
Yeah, I love it. Well, Rich, there's so much we could talk about. I'll have to have another conversation in the future. And after we sign off, I'm going to tell everybody about your books and where they can find them. But where can they find you? Just as we sign off, where will they find you on the internet?
Unseminary.com is a great place. So it's one of my convictions are that churches are impacted by the stuff they didn't teach you in seminary. And so we would do I would do an article a week, a couple podcasts a week, and I'd love to have people come over there.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much for your time.
Thank you.
All right, take care. I think that was such a rich conversation with my friend Rich Birch of Unseminary. So if you haven't heard of him before, now you're going to want to go to unseminary.com and check out Rich and all these resources. There's so much more there, so much useful stuff for all of us who are serving, working, and ministering in church or leadership context and volunteer context in church. He's written a book. We didn't talk much about it on the podcast, but the book is called Church Growth Flywheel, 5 Practical Systems to Drive Growth at Your Church. And if you like what he had to say here, you're going to love reading more in depth about what he's seeing happening in church and what you can learn from his book. So check out unseminary.com about him. But let me tell you about where we're going in the future. As I said in the beginning, this is the last episode of season 1 of Word Made Digital. And I got to tell you, I am so grateful to you as the listeners. I've loved your feedback. I've loved how you have been sharing and posting and subscribing and reviewing and all this kind of stuff. Man, it's been an amazing and fun time to to do this. This started out as kind of an experiment for me to see if I enjoyed it, to see if you enjoyed it. And in the end, I'm learning that I've been having a really good time doing this podcast. I'm learning right alongside you as we talk to all these people and listen to their wisdom. And also, I'm learning that it's of value to you. I'm getting that kind of feedback. So I think there's reason to do season 2. And I got to say, too, we've had at this point, about 10,000 downloads of season 1 as of January here, January 2019. That's like way more people and way more downloads than I expected for season 1. It's just really exceeded my expectations. And that's because of you and because of you sharing it and liking it and getting involved and finding value in the interviews that we're having. So thank you so much. It's been amazing. And season 2 is going to be coming. We are going to take a pause for 2 reasons. One, I'm developing season 2. I've already begun. I think of about 10 interviews under my belt at this point, and I want to be farther ahead on that before we launch. People like, let me hint at this, Lisa Bevere, Shayla Visser, she's behind the Alpha Film series, the leadership of that. Emily P. Freeman, I interviewed her about Next Right Thing. Do you know that podcast? She's got a book coming out all about the Next Right Thing. You're going to love it. We're talking to the Belonging Co. out of Nashville, just this church that's grown creatively and in size and all kinds of other ways in the last few years. We're going to talk to some of their creative and worship pastors. We're looking at someone who's on Hillsong TV, Helen Burns. We're talking to CJ Cassiotta. We're talking to Katie Strandland. She's the executive director at Christine Kane Ministries. And man, so many more. There's a bunch more people that I'm interviewing for season 2. If I haven't already, I'm going to be doing that in the near future. But meanwhile, let me tell you about a new podcast. I said last week, I teased this for you, that James Adams, my friend from Visual Media Church, and I are starting a new podcast. This podcast is the Future Church Podcast, and it's going to be a daily pod that's 5 days a week, but short like 5 or 10 minutes on really practical, useful tips for all things church communications and media and design and photography and video in the church. We're both people who work in and serve churches every day, and so we want to offer really practical stuff to you guys every day that we're going to be doing that. So you got to subscribe here, because when you subscribe here, you're going to see when this new podcast starts. I'm going to announce it here when that podcast is starting. And if you subscribe, you'll actually know when we start season 2. We're going to be starting season 2 in the beginning of March here on Word Made Digital. So all to say, all of that, I'm so grateful. I'm so thankful for you as our listeners and as we're growing this community. Keep sharing this. Maybe you want to go back and binge on some episodes, or you want to share this and recommend it to someone else to binge. And you got to subscribe so that you know when things are coming next, as we develop new things in the next coming weeks to offer you some value and to offer you really some encouragement in all the work you do. I think what you're doing is so important as leaders, as communicators, as creatives in the church. What you're doing really matters, whether you work in the church or not. And I hope that that comes across in every interview that we do, that we as the church all around the world, we have the most important message in the world. And so I just want to help you be the best communicators and creatives that you can be with that message. Well, God bless you. Can't wait to see you on season 2. Take care.
Thanks for listening to the Word Made Digital podcast with Joanna LaFleur. Head over to joannalafleur.com for more practical tools, interviews, and videos for creatives and communicators. We'd love to help you be the best you can be at communicating the best news in the world. Tap that subscribe button.